podcast. Tonight's webinar might be my favorite webinar because it's at the heart of everything that we do. And for me, it was something that took a while to develop. When I first came to wilderness therapy over 22 years ago, I recognized right away how powerful and effective this delivery method for therapy was. But what I didn't know was what was it about it that made it so effective, that made it so dynamic and powerful. And like I talk about all the time, it really is a delivery method because there are so many therapies that we use at Evoke, from 12-step to dialectical behavioral therapy to cognitive behavioral therapy to family therapy to ACT therapy. There are various approaches that we use that are all evidence-based. And with that, you're doing it in a natural setting. Sometimes the clients and students will talk about wanting to get back to the real world. Sometimes people will talk about, can you apply these principles in the real world? And I always find that to be a strange idea or concept, that this kind of contrived world that we live in, the unnatural world, the virtual world, becomes the real world for us. And living in nature on the ground is not the real world. Years ago, when I was working with the Boy Scouts in my area, I was asked to provide for them a primitive living winter camping experience in the Utah mountains. And of course, it wasn't my expertise, so I brought in some of my staff to help. And at the end of a very difficult afternoon and evening of setting up camp in 6 or 7 feet of packed snow in the Uinta Mountains in the winter, and being exhausted with trying to keep the Boy Scouts safe and dry and cook dinner and all the challenges that were being presented to us, I laid down in my sleeping bag in a tent next to one of my staff, next to my senior instructor. And I asked him, I said, you guys do this on your vacation, you do this on your days off, how do you do this? And he said, without any kind of drama, he said, it just doesn't get any more real than this. And it was just that moment again where I saw how being in the wilderness is so unfiltered, and that we have so many distractions and so many things to pull us away from it, that we lose an idea of what it really means to be alive. And I started in wilderness therapy in 1995. And in 1995, we hadn't yet experienced the advent and the proliferation of smartphones and the electronic proliferation of all that we now experience. And we still saw the value of getting out in nature. And so when we think about that, and when we think about what our context, what our environment is today, it would lend to us the idea that everybody could benefit from this intervention. So let me talk about the theoretical aspects of it, about where it comes from, why we at Evoke specifically engage in a primitive living nomadic model versus an adventure therapy model or a horticulture therapy model, why we think and see the value. I was talking to one of my gifted field staff many years ago, driving him home from the office, and on a long drive home to Salt Lake City, I was asking him, because he'd been in wilderness therapy at that time longer than I had as a field guide. And I said to him, what makes it so effective in your mind? And he was talking about the magic of it. He was talking about how amazing it was to be in nature, and how it just created something different. His words were vague, they were poetic a little bit, but they weren't very specific. And what I said to him, I think we owe it to our clients to have a more theoretical, grounded answer, because what they want to do is they want to take whatever principles, whatever ideas, whatever is present here, they want to take that with them when they go home or when they go to the next business. And if we just speak in poetic terms, we don't offer much to them. So at that point, I embarked on this idea of what makes it theoretically sound. Why does it work? Why is it effective? And really, this goes back to long before I started working at wilderness. I had a class at Brigham Young University called Family Psychology 221. The title of it was Spiritual Life and Temporal Relationships in the Home. I had no idea what that meant. Didn't make sense to me, but it came recommended by somebody else, and I went ahead and joined the course. And it was taught by Kathleen Barr. And right at the outset of the class, she showed us a couple of documentaries. And the first documentary was about a day in the life of the Mother of the Year in Utah. And it was amazing. It was this amazing amount of energy and organization. And she talked about this mother and how everything was charted, planned, diagrammed. I remember there was one specific moment when the children were playing in their kind of breakfast room, and she gathered them all together to have organized calisthenics. When they took their naps in the afternoon, she cleaned the house for them, and so she had this amazing ability to organize her life and to be intentional about the curriculum of life for her children. So we watched that, and without any kind of analysis, the class ended, and then we came back the next day, the next class period. And again, she showed us another documentary without any preparation. And it was about a primitive tribe, I believe in Africa. And it was kind of a day in the life of this tribe. And there was a division of labor, the men going out hunting and gathering with the young men, and the mothers staying home with all the young children and the young girls. And the mothers would fish, and they would take care of the home, the village, be responsible for all that, and the men would go out and hunt. And then at the end of the day, they would all gather together, and they would eat together, and they would tell stories, and they would sing songs. And it was interesting because their stories, their legends, their myths were all about the struggle to survive. It wasn't separate from their daily life. And so then we sat and we contrasted these two cultures, these two ways of life. And what our professor helped us to understand is this idea that in more primitive cultures, the struggle for survival is how lessons and values and meaning and belonging are passed on. Right? It's attached together. Whereas in a more advanced culture like ours, it was more contrived. It was more difficult to teach the law of the harvest, for example, when you live in a traditional urban or suburban house, where maybe your parents have professional jobs like being a dentist or being an accountant, and money comes out of an ATM. On a farm or in a primitive culture, the law of the harvest was evident. It was necessary to understand it to survive. In our home, it was more difficult to communicate these lessons, these values that are important and essential to life, because everything has become so contrived and so separated. So we looked at Abraham Maslow, and he's a famous sociologist who has this theory. And the basics, and I've simplified it here, are that at the lowest level, the most fundamental level of human need is our safety, our physical needs. And then if we can't get those met, or if those are challenged for us, it's more difficult to work on the higher level needs, the sense of belonging and community, and eventually the sense of self. This was his idea. Hard to work on the sense of self when you're struggling with health, when you're struggling with survival. What we had just watched and witnessed was that more primitive cultures combined them all together. That Maslow was, or at least our understanding of Maslow, right? Our interpretation. And it's a very American idea that you take care of all the basic needs, but you can work on these more philosophical endeavors. But the cultures that we saw, this way of thinking, it was in the context of struggling, of working, of taking care of the basic needs, that all of those lessons were passed on. She used the example of ice cream, right? In a primitive situation, we all know how ice cream used to be made, was made. Some of us have participated on, even before electricity. There was a hand crank, right? There was a bucket in the middle where the ingredients were put. There was ice all around it, and salt had to be put around the ice. And you spun this bucket. And there was a blade in the bucket. And you spun it by hand. You had to take turns because it was exhausting. People had to make sure that the ice was being replaced and salt was being put on it, and the ingredients were put on. It took an entire family to do it. And at the end, you have this wonderful, small little cup of runny, soft, and delicious ice cream that you all share. Contrast that with today's culture, where we buy a half a gallon of ice cream from the store to save time. For what? And typically the for what is being on a computer, being on an electronic device, or being on watching television. Right? So a lot of our improvements, she suggested, are as much barriers to our sense of community and humanity as they are solutions. She used other examples of how much house cleaning we do now, how much work we do now. Vacuuming versus taking a rug outside and beating it, which again took more than one person. Whereas now somebody can vacuum in a short period of time, and they do more often. And the amount of clothes that we wash, we have a larger wardrobe than our ancestors did. Right? It's more convenient. But does that really save us any time? And what do we do at that time? So there's an idea here. Will White, who gathered all of the wilderness programs that he had access to and interviewed them and talked to them and wrote a dissertation and eventually a book on the history of wilderness therapy, pulled out a quote from one of the creators of wilderness therapy. And he said this creator said, whenever we adopted what we have come to call contrived experience, the overall impact diminished for the participants. So the more contrived, the more created it was versus natural, the less impactful it was for the participants. I love this quote. This was from my class by Professor Dorothy Lee in Harvard. She was an anthropology professor in 1959. And she says this, and this is also in my book. The preface of my book talks about this idea at length. She said, when my first child was 2 or 3, I used to shell peas with her. Nowadays, I buy my peas already shelled and packaged. This saves time and the peas are fresher. But was this all that happened when I shelled peas with my daughter? Did I merely get a dish of peas? It was a total process. And if I am going to see that the totality of the important aspects are retained, I shall have to find out what they were and then find the medium through which they can continue to be expressed. So it's in the context of work, in the context of work that we learn what it means to belong to a family, right, to a community, because you rely on each other. And in a sense, you learn about who you are, and part of that is about efficacy. Part of that is about doing something difficult or uncomfortable or challenging, and that we make a difference. External locus of control, which is that which happens to me, defines me and determines my happiness and sense of meaning, versus internal locus of control, which is how I deal with it, my choices, what I do makes a difference. We know from the research that primitive nomadic wilderness therapy changes locus of control from external, the world creates my happiness, to internal, I create my happiness and meaning. So I want to talk about why wilderness, what it does. I'll talk a little bit more about our model versus the other models out there. Why wilderness? It's a metaphor, right? Everything is a metaphor, right? The rain, the forest, the desert, everything becomes a lesson and the challenges that we face. We use a rites of passage model, right, where they're introduced into various phases and different roles of the group through ceremony. And they do this as they accomplish certain things throughout. It's a positive peer milieu, and I can't state this clearly enough, that is enhanced by this small communal living. You get a sense of identity about who you are. And part of that is the quietness, the noble silence of nature. Right? What can you feel in nature that you might not be able to feel or be inclined to feel where you are at home, stimulated by all the distractions that sometimes we think of as wonderful, enjoying, entertaining aspects of life, but taking that time out of it. And what can that do to your mood and to your anxiety? I visited with a with a therapist who does some research in New York City years ago. And he talked about, and the reason that he loved wilderness therapy was because of his research. He talked about this idea that they would measure sleep patterns, movement patterns at night. And they would see improvement in ADHD and depression and oppositionality and other aspects of adolescence. And he said part of the improvement they would see is when they limited screen time, when they got at least 8.5 hours of sleep, and when they cut high sugar food with preservatives out of their diet. Very simple things. And he said, you do that in wilderness inherently, all of that. Sleep is improved, right? Screen time, of course, is completely negated. and we provide a healthy, nutritious diet without all of the preservatives and additives of many fast foods or pre-prepared foods. I think resistant adolescents and young adults, wilderness therapy works very effectively because when you speak in the language of metaphor and experiential therapy, what you do is you bypass resistance. And you bypass resistance because you're not walking in the front door and talking about the issues, right? You're talking about the group this afternoon. You're talking about the conflict around the chores that happened this morning. You're talking about the bow drill fire. You're talking about the packing and the cycle. We call it cycles when they have different tasks to do. And the challenge it was for you or for the group to meet cycles. And all of those to the adolescent, to the young adult, seem specific to this incident. But of course, as a therapist, you draw out of those experiences application to everyday life. The desire to want to go home, the impulse to want to run, the power struggle with the staff, the way that they get along, and how they so perfectly. And this is amazing because it's anywhere from 6 to 10 clients or students in a group with 3 or 4 staff. They recreate the relationships that they had at home. They find people to put in the same roles as brother and sister and mother and father and friend. And so you draw from those metaphors, right? From that microcosm of small group living, you draw upon that to do the therapy. And whenever you walk in through the front door with anybody, you're more likely to encounter defense. But if you come around the back door or the side door, you're less likely to encounter defense. Self-esteem, self-efficacy through accomplishment, right? That's something that I think a lot of our clients will struggle with their potential, with following through. They're afraid not to succeed. They're afraid to fail. They're afraid to be less than perfect. They've been praised for their potential, for their intelligence, for their giftedness in various areas in life. And so there's no possibility except for failure. Because anything less than living up to that is a failure. Whereas out here, they just struggle. And it's crazy. One of the things that they say so often is it's like this archetype that they embody when they get there is the I can't. I can't do this. And sometimes your heart just bends for them, right? You see how difficult it is and how foreign it is for them. And they say, I can't do the winter. I can't do the cold. I can't do the holidays. I can't be away from my girlfriend or my boyfriend. I can't be away from my family. And you empathize and you listen and you encourage. And what you know in your head is you can. You can do all of it. And you will do this. And you'll feel better about yourself for doing this. I described the group microcosm. Most parents will say that after a very short period of time when the therapist is giving his or her weekly updates, they'll say, my son or my daughter as well or better than anybody who's ever seen him or her. The removal of distractions and defenses, like I talked about, the digital detox, as we call it, but also the distractions of other things in life, of other entertainment in life, of the noise of life. It can be a part of a balanced life for sure. The inability to manipulate wilderness. I experience that as somebody who goes into the wilderness to visit the group, right? The rain, the snow, the hot, the cold, the bugs. It takes a kind of an adjustment, a mindfulness adjustment for me when I go out there because my environment at home is so much in control. Inside of my car is so much in control. But right when I get out there, I recognize my utter powerlessness to control nature. I experienced this profoundly, especially when I went to visit my own son in the wilderness. I had at that time been a wilderness therapist for 10 years or so. And when I went out to the wilderness and it was raining and it was getting in the way of what I thought was the activities that were planned for us as a family, I remember thinking, why did it have to rain on my visit? And of course, I heard myself, the therapist part of me, saying right away, this is the therapy. This is part of what you do in your families. You're always in control of things. You take up so much space with that control. And so learning to be patient, learning to go with it, modeling that with your son, with your family is an important part of it. a sterile assessment environment. It's not sterile, of course, physically, but it's sterile in terms of the amount of distractions that are removed. And I can't state the importance of this too greatly. The fact that staff shifts go for 8 days. Right? The same staff are with your child for 8 days in a row. They overlap on one day. They have 6 days off. That's a big deal. These aren't 12-hour shifts even, or 18-hour shifts, or day-long shifts. These are 8-day shifts. So you see a continuity, a seamlessness of the treatment plan and the follow-through and the interventions and the approaches. And then we do it as best as we can to repeat that same staff coming back to you on their next rotation. And so that assessment that happens in real time, even when children struggle more than other children, we talk about what we're learning about them, about their coping, what is successful, what clearly isn't successful. The removal of negative influences, while there is that to a large degree, I would like to say that's more about the ability to supervise, right? I always think it's an ideal process for a child, for a student or client, if they have a time in the group where they're one of the higher functioning members of the group, more positive members, or another time in the group when they're one of the more negative members, because we learn something from both experiences, right? We learn when there are positive influences on the group, and we learn when there are negative influences. I've even had clients come into the program who knew each other at home. And while it's a parent's first instinct to want to remove them and place them in a different group, we always say, let's just wait and see, right? And think about this. Ideally, wouldn't you send your child and their peer group all at the same time, if you could, if there was going to be supervision 24/7 of them, and to treat that in real time, because the peer dynamic can be so influential in young people's lives. So the removal of negative influences might be more properly said as observable and intervened, watched over influences. There's a vulnerability that comes from being outside of your comfort zone. Even if your child has done some camping and hiking, there's something raw about living outside for many weeks at a time. Carrying all of your shelter, all of your food on your back as a group from location to location 5 days a week. 2 days a week, of course, being the therapist days where they don't hike. Development of interdependence, right? Learning to rely on each other. I'll tell you this. The relationship with a client changes. And I've had relationships with clients outside of wilderness therapy for many years also. The relationship of a client changes when they need you to be okay physically, when you have something to offer them, to teach them. And bottom line is, we're not going to let them be unsafe physically, even if they're incapable or unmotivated to take care of themselves. And so when I would come out, when we go out each week, therapists, we bring fruit and vegetables, right? The staff teach them how to build a shelter when it's raining. We teach them how to pack a pack so they can carry it more easily. We teach them how to cook food. That changes the relationship, because you're already in a mentor-mentee relationship, and that you can kind of borrow on that relationship, that dynamic, when it comes to the therapeutic, the teaching aspect of life and of the program. The futility of old coping mechanisms. This is important because I think they have to learn that what they've been doing doesn't work. And they have to try it. Some of them try it for a long time, but that's not lost. I'm going to borrow from behavioral theory for just a moment because it's critical. For somebody to be willing to change, they've got to experience that their old ways of doing it don't work, right? And they've got to realize that it's more painful to stay in it, to stay in the old way, than the fear of embracing something new. And that's not easy. And lastly, when you take away the reward of old unwanted behavior, you're not getting out of it what you were getting out of it before. There's going to be an extinction burst, which means sometimes an increase in it. Think of a tantrum in a grocery store when you stop giving into it. The child's tantrum is going to be at the highest level. That's number one. But it's going to go on for a while, because Like if you're like any human parent, you've intermittently reinforced them, right? Sometimes because of exhaustion, because of being worn down, you give in. And we all do that. And intermittent reinforcement is the hardest type of behavior that's intermittently reinforced is the hardest type of behavior to extinguish. Think of a slot machine, right? It's intermittent reinforcement. And what do you believe if you're on a cold run with a slot machine and you're feeling that addictive pull that is that intermittent reinforcement? One more time, just one more time. If I up the ante a little bit, I'm going to win. So there's got to be some experience of the futility of the old ways of coping. I want to talk a little bit about the distinction between primitive nomadic, which is our model, and adventure therapy. I talk about the difference between kind of real life and vacation therapy. If any of you have dated somebody where the first few times you dated, you were going on vacation together, it's kind of easy to fall in love in those kinds of experiences. Of course, when the relationship matures and you're dealing with kind of the day-to-day drudgery of everyday life, of laundry, of bill paying and stuff, that really challenges, stresses us out. And how can we then be with each other under that kind of stress? It's the Disneyland parent versus the parent who's the everyday parent. I have been both a Disneyland parent and an everyday parent and know the pros and cons. And, you know, recreation is wonderful. It's a critical, essential part of a balanced life. And this is primary care. Right? This is the focus. This is limited time, and you increase the intensity when you focus it. I will tell you this. They have fun every day, but it's not by rappelling down a mountain, right? They have every day by kicking a sack around, or they make up games, or they have sock hockey, they call it, right? Or they have campfire games. They play riddle games, and they can do this for hours, right? These games that they just make for themselves. It's almost like our parents or grandparents used to say, right? We just went outside and picked up a couple of sticks and made up a game. It's kind of like that. And there's something creative and organic about that. Yes, I love adventure activities in my life. Still to this day, they're an important part of my life and my family's life. And I love when we're up at a cabin with no electronics and we play a card game or we tell ghost stories, right? There's something about that that's really raw. So there's the microcosm of real life, right? Evoke is kind of this small version of the universe, right? It's intensified, amplified. It replicates what real life is like. And adventure therapy or recreational therapy is nice, and there's lessons in it. And if that becomes your primary approach, there's a loss there. There's a loss to it. There's a trend in our culture to replace hard work with recreation. That comes from a book, and they talk about this in a book called Nurture Shock. It's a research-driven book about trends in parenting. And that makes sense to us because recreation, it provides everybody something entertaining, right? It provides parents a relief. Everybody's happy. It's kind of that any port in the storm parenting that we all can relate to. But what it doesn't do as well is as some of the hard work, some of the chores, some of the tasks, primitive nomadic tasks, is it doesn't teach frustration tolerance as well, delay of gratification, mood regulation, conflict resolution. I had a client who said years ago, in fact, I had somebody call me to tell me that this was said. They'd come from a recreational program, an adventure-based wilderness therapy program. And the clients were at a school, and they were sharing their experiences. And one of the parents asked one of the boys, you went to an adventure program. What's that like? He said, well, that's a program that your parents send you to when they don't have the guts to send you to a real wilderness therapy program. And of course, it sounded good to my ear. And I'll admit, we have considered changing to an adventure therapy program model. It's not because we think it's a better model. We don't. We've done it because there's pressure kind of appeal to get people in the door. That people at times are attracted, parents are attracted because the relief that it offers them, and I'll talk more about this, to sign their child up to get their child into an adventure-based program. Many of these adventure-based programs have a base camp. They get in a vehicle, right? They go back to a base camp. Sometimes they have a therapist that has clients in several different groups, which offers them flexibility, but doesn't create the same kind of experience where one or two therapists are running their own group. Typically for us, it's one, sometimes it's two, where they're running their own group, right? They can create group culture and group expectations and group interventions. So base camps, getting in a vehicle, spending a lot of time in buildings, and then going out for adventure, whitewater rafting, mountain biking, rappelling. We think something is lost in that experience that happens, that we still have in a nomadic, primitive living model where they're outside for their entire stay. Why does it sell? I alluded to that just a moment ago. It gets kids to buy in, but really it's about the parent. It alleviates the parent's guilt and fear. First of all, their guilt about sending their child away, and their fear that the children are going to be angry. I have this quote from my book. I'll read it. It'll take just a moment to read. Ours, speaking of Evoke, is not an adventure therapy program replete with rappelling, mountain biking, or whitewater rafting. While play is an essential part of a balanced life, the use of recreation as the principal modality often serves to soothe parents' guilt when sending their child to a therapeutic program. Adventure therapy can be effective, but if the issue is parental guilt is not addressed, the family will stay stuck in old patterns. In Nurture Shock, Bronson and Merriman address the pitfall of an increasing trend of parents replacing hard work with recreation. This trend, they suggest, ensures that everybody is happy, but only in the short term. Parents feel less stress, guilt, or personal discomfort. And with their kids entertained and distracted, parents survive to fight another day. Any parent can relate to those motives. In the primitive living milieu, or camping therapy, as some call it, the inherent challenges of nature and group living foster community, problem solving, healthy communication, and resiliency. It is neither punitive nor deprivational. Instead, it is natural. Nature's elements are the antagonists. And in facing nature's challenges, the wilderness student thrives. Some say wilderness therapy living is a metaphor for life, but I find the concept backwards. How can living in the natural world be the metaphor and living in the modern world with virtual reality be the real world? So that's the essence of it. And we still are willing to fight for it and get it out there and speak to parents about the value and the reward and the investment that this program offers. And the fact that children end up loving it and loving themselves. They come back to work for it. Let's talk about the goals of wilderness therapy. You get your attention, right? You create a new bottom. That's an old idea from intervention and from alcohol and drug treatment, right? This is a new low, a wake-up call. And if done in a therapeutic, compassionate way, can be a moment for them to refocus and turn around. It's a way to manage a crisis, right? You settle things down, you get somebody in treatment, then you can make the long-term decision that's based on the something that happens. Individualized treatment planning, right? Small groups, 6 to 10 students, 3 to 4 staff, 8-day shifts, 1 therapist, maybe 2 in some exceptions, in a group. And within that kind of, what we would call a kind of control group, if you will, right? There's a lot of variables that we're controlling. We can see what's really going on with the child. Assessment in the natural environment as well as formal testing in a sterile, controlled environment. So you can have testing done out there when all the things that I mentioned before were removed, including the use of any drugs or alcohol recreationally. Family systems work. I think it's one of the most, I know it just because it's what we do, families are willing to work more when their children are in wilderness therapy. It's a vulnerable thing for them. It's a vulnerable thing for any parent to have your child in a treatment program. But there's something so foreign about wilderness that families are more willing to work in a short period of time with us. It prepares students for the next setting. It helps move participants from resignation, acceptance to investment, right? You take off the sharp edges, the behavioral edges, so they can go to an environment where if they didn't come to wilderness, they wouldn't be able to handle it. They'd be too behavioral. but wilderness can kind of mellow things out, calm things down. It has a softening effect, taking the sharp edges off of demonstrative or dangerous behaviors, like I just said. It changes the level of care for long-term care, right? Sometimes they can go to intensive outpatient program or therapeutic school with more community involvement after going to wilderness. It gives them great socialization skills and practice, especially with our autism spectrum disorder, but with all of our clients. It provides an assessment, both objective testing and natural observation, while in a stable, substance-free environment. Our model, of course, uses clinical sophistication. It's kind of what we created in the field of wilderness therapy in 1998 when we started our program, is they were going to be led by therapists. Now that's, of course, much more common, but was rare back then. It was just coming to that point. When we started our program in 1998, we decided that that's how it was going to be. In addition to family involvement, which did not occur before our program to any extent, except for maybe a reunion process at the end. Individual treatment plan, flexible length of stay, flexible programming, right? Clinical needs were going to be first and foremost. Of course, we have an unblemished safety record. We helped rewrite the state requirements regarding wilderness, safety, medical care, pack weight, hiking temperatures, for example. You could do something in wilderness that you can't do in some treatment centers. Think about a school or program or a residential setting, right? It's hard to say that you can be a lot of things to a lot of people because that's 1 million. In wilderness therapy, we have several groups who never see or interact with each other. So you can have a group over here that has very little to no drug use, that works with kids who are on the autism spectrum disorder, school refusal, school anxiety, right? Gaming addiction. Then you have a group over here whose primary treatment plan includes substance abuse disorder. You have a group over here that primarily deals with mood issues, anxiety and depression. And then you have other groups that have general and crossover. But you can really be a lot of things to a lot of people when you have these small groups led by a therapist, trained in a model to help the specific population, and then training that staff that work with that group. Owner involvement, of course, not a corporation. And then communication and family involvement, both customer service with your parent coordinator, but the amount of family work which simply did not exist before we created our program. And of course, we worked over the past 20 years to increase that more and more and more. So there's more involvement, from having a mentor to these broadcasts, to the parent portal, to the parent workshop midway through the program, to the parent groups in selected cities. Like all of that is something that we've increased over the years. A little bit about the research and what it tells us works, why wilderness therapy works. The relationship with the field instructor. That makes a big difference. Again, the staff shifts that I mentioned. And it's true about wilderness therapy in general, but I want to say something about Evoke. Our staff are as skilled and as knowledgeable as a lot of programs therapists are. We really are proud of that. We train them. We have them in session, every session. We teach them about theory. I supervise them and talk about transference and countertransference, their own stuff, what they bring to the table, their own baggage, how it relates, how it can get in the way, how to get around it, how to assess, right? Very sophisticated clinical supervision. So they have that, and then they're just there with them. They operate somewhere between the role of a mentor and the role of a therapist. And they're there, like I said, for 8 days in a row. Small group living is a big deal. And in the small group living, they talk about the work makes a difference, the survival skills makes a difference, and the leverage and containment, right? By containment, I mean being able to hold them, and not because there are 4 walls and a locked door, but because they're so far away there's nowhere to go. Literally and metaphorically. They have to be there. And they want to get back to mainstream life. I had a therapist years ago. He had moved from our program to a residential treatment center and then back to our program. When he came back to our program a year or so later, he brought with him a couple of clients from his from the school that he was a therapist for. And the reason he did is because they were near the end of their stay and they weren't quite ready. And he thought, a few weeks, a couple of months maybe in a wilderness program before they go home, and they'll be ready to go home. They were that close. And he said he brought one student in who at times would power struggle with him, not do his assignment. And when he was in the school, this young man would just not talk in session or not do his work. And he shared this with us at clinical meeting one evening. He said, I was in session and my client, so-and-so, did that thing that he does, where he said, I'm not going to work, I'm not going to talk. And a few minutes into the session, Dave, the therapist, said, okay, I'm done, I'll see you next week. And the young man said, no, don't go. Come back, stay here. I'll talk. And it was just, David wasn't trying to threaten him or intimidate. He just said, just spend another week out here. I come out once a week for 2 days, spend another week, see what it's like, and see if you're ready yet. There's something about wilderness that creates change. And living in the comfort of a school where you get brought food, you go to the cafeteria, you can lie in your bed. There's something comfortable about that where resistance is okay. I can wait this out. But hiking and camping every day in the snow and the rain and the heat and the bugs, right? All of that, the communal living, all the challenges of it, you don't take it for granted as much. And of course, the wilderness itself. That's something about wilderness, is you can't take it for granted, right? We take things for granted. I love this quote by the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, where he says, the first thing that happens when you get a toothache is you remember the non-toothache, right? You remember that you were taking for granted that your tooth had not ached before that. Think about that right now. That's what meditation and mindfulness is about. That's what helps with gratitude, is do we think about the fact that we don't have a toothache until we get a toothache. And so wilderness therapy helps you remember the non-toothache. It helps you, showering isn't easy, right? Working together as a group to build a fire, to keep it going, to cook it in these primitive pans that we use with primitive ingredients, right? To sleep in a sleeping bag under a shelter that you built. You don't take for granted so many things that we all take for granted. That's part of the richness of it. The physical and emotional challenges, they talk about problem solving in the research, the use of metaphor, relationship skills. Experiential education resources research talks about there's an active learning process and that rituals make a difference. And of course, clients talk about in the research solo. The time when they spend time by themselves for 48 or 72 hours. Right? They're observed by the staff, but they don't interact with anybody else, any of the peers, or with the staff unless it's an emergency. And they take care of themselves and they think. They don't have assignments or books. They just spend time thinking and remembering. In terms of safety, the outdoor behavioral health care programs average injury rates of 1.12 per 1,000 participant days, compared with backpacking in the quote-unquote real world, the front country, 2.05, downhill skiing 3.28, or football practice 19.74. And that comes from our research and our outdoor behavioral research. A participant is, I believe the number is 10 times more likely to need an emergency room visit when they're at home versus when they're in the wilderness. A typical day in the program looks like this. There's wake-up orientation. They're cleaning the fire pit from the night before. Morning group, there might be a meditation. Some hiking, lunch, personal time where they're working on letters to you, reading letters from you, assignments given to them by the therapist. Also school curriculum, hiking in the afternoon. Get to camp, set it up. Chores, camp setup, fire building, preparing dinner and eating. Chores are rotated each day. Group therapy at night, and then sleeping. That's kind of a typical day. Now, throughout the week and throughout the day, you're also going to have these events, standing groups. That's a spontaneous group, anywhere from a couple to 10 standing groups per day, where they're talking about problem solving, conflict resolution. Somebody had a bad letter the day before and they're not feeling very up that day, and so they'll talk about it and check in with the group. Individual sessions with the staff. They have individual sessions with the staff while they're hiking, while they're sitting at camp. Layovers, that's about 2 days a week, sometimes 3 days a week, where they're not moving and they're taking care of all the logistics. The days when the therapists are there typically, so that we can read and write and go over assignments, right, and sit and focus. They also get their laundry, their opportunity to do showers during layover days. They get new food twice a week. They get fresh fruits or vegetables every day. Personal time can happen at any time or during these layover days. They have an emotional curriculum, right, that uses both hard skills, that is, tying knots, making a shelter, making a bow drill fire, making a leather pouch, making crafts for themselves to wear for the holidays, for gifts. They also have soft skills, which is learning to communicate assertively, not swearing, not being aggressive, identifying feelings, right? Problem solving, communication, listening. Then they have therapy assignments, and those are the assignments that the therapy puts on top of all the skills that are inherent in the daily week. That's the reading, the special book, the special assignment. There's academic curriculum. You can get 2 credits while you're with us if you're an adolescent. You can also engage in a college course if you're with us and you're a young adult. Letters to and from home, solos like I mentioned, chores, and then everything becomes grist for the therapeutic mill, right? Everything that goes on becomes an opportunity for therapy. Family involvement, like I said, the proliferation of family work and wellness therapy started with our program in 1998. Weekly phone calls with the therapist, of course, is the basic. Before we started our program, it was a half an hour a week with your therapist, update, and that was virtually all you got, right? Essentially, every wellness program just provided that. We immediately extended to an hour and then started involving technology to help with all of it. A parent coordinator that you can ask logistical questions with any day. They can help you with the parent portal, basic assignments, anything you need to ask that you don't need to talk to your specific therapist about. We have a parent portal, a very active parent portal that updates each week for you personally. The therapist can take away or add assignments there. It includes reading lists, home assignments, like parent therapy, 12-step attendance, other family curriculum, writing assignments, weekly digital pictures, and a group journal. The Family Mentor Program. This is something we started about the time that my son was in the program. Each family receives a call from a former parent, an alumni parent, in the first 3 days to help them through the process, to answer any questions, to talk peer-to-peer about what those early feelings and experiences are like. Letter writing family therapy, which I think is one of the most undervalued or undernoticed aspects of wellness therapy. The fact that most of our therapy is letter writing therapy. It provides a very slow, very deliberate, very intentional, very aware kind of family therapy because you're reading it. You're taking days to respond, not happening in the moment. You're learning new language. It's there in black and white. You can look at it. You can talk about it on your weekly phone calls. Phone calls in the field with a student when it's clinically appropriate, of course. Mid-program visits. Those are 2 things that we started, the phone calls and the mid-program visits that didn't exist before our program. The parent workshop. We would like every parent to come out to a workshop while their child is with us. And there will be a workshop during your child's stay. So talk to your parent coordinator about the next parent workshop. I'll talk about that at the end as I do every one of these broadcasts. Parent meetings in selected cities, specifically the Bay Area, Southern California, New York, Washington, D.C., Toronto, Chicago, and others. Try to get to as many as we can. Just have that point of contact, that reminder. These webinars, broadcasts, podcasts, of course, are a lifetime membership. So you can have these for as long as possible. The podcasts are available to anybody, but the live webinars are also available for as long as you would like. To come back, check in, ask questions, remind yourself, hear the same kind of language that you heard while your child was with them. Who goes to wellness therapy? Oppositional, mood disorders, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, of course, learning differences such as ADHD, school refusal or withdrawal, family conflict, self-esteem, low motivation, autism spectrum disorder, including nonverbal learning disability, and of course, adolescent, young adults. Footsteps we don't have anymore, but we have young adult programming, so anywhere from about 13 to 35 is our typical age group. Frequently asked questions. This is my last slide without pictures. Is it a boot camp? It is not. It is not an intimidating approach. I talk about that. If you want more information about our approach, read the book Motivational Interviewing or listen to the podcast or webinar on motivational interviewing. If you use force, coercion, intimidation, shame, or guilt to get change, and those things can, in the short run, make change, you don't really do a lot to invoke lasting change. How can things be improved when the family is separated? It's just a short pause in the grand scheme of things. It's a chance for everybody to be more clear about themselves, about their sin, both the parent and the child, right? You're not caught up in the back and forth, the ping pong kind of exchange. You have time to sit and to think and not react. I've talked about this, how it's so hard to maintain a sense of yourself in the presence of the other person sometimes, right? All the voices in our head become distracting sometimes in the presence of the other. So it's a pause. It's like initially when your child is brought to an emergency room, there's a physical problem. They don't let you in the emergency room. But after your child is stabilized, you come in for visits. What about phone calls or visits? When it's clinically appropriate. That's when we have them. What happens after Evoke? There's a treatment plan. About 60% or so to 80%, depending upon adolescent versus young adult, go to some kind of setting. Sober living environment, transitional living, residential treatment center, therapeutic boarding school. If you want more information about that, listen to the podcast or watch the webinar on how to choose the best fit aftercare. What are the medical precautions? There is a wilderness EMT or equivalent in every group all the time. All the staff are trained in CPR and first aid, of course. And then we have satellite phones and GPS, and we can get, if in a severe emergency, we can get life flight out there ASAP. And we have access to a doctor and to a nurse all the time, and we have physicals every 2 weeks. I described what a typical day was like with the menu. It's typically non-sugar, natural foods, vegetables, rice, beans, cheese, some meat, tuna, fish, other things that can be packaged and kept safe out there. Over time, we try to use as many local and organic ingredients as possible. We allow for spices, and we have very little sugar offered to them. How much therapy? It's all therapy. The therapist is there for 2 days a week, but that's not where the bulk of the therapy happens. That's where the bulk of the treatment planning happens. That's where the formal therapy sessions with the therapist happen. But the therapy is all day, every day, and it is dynamic and intense. The parental involvement is as much as clinically as appropriate and as much as you're willing to do. In some ways, we probably provide so much that you can't do it all, and that's okay. You can talk about that. But we want to provide you as many aspects as we think can be helpful. And then the training of staff, like I said, they're in every session every week. We do a weekly in-service with them. We supervise them. We go over treatment plans each week at the beginning and end of the week with the therapist and the staff, and they have a mid-week phone call where they update the therapist. They can call anytime and ask the therapist a question or suggest a change in the treatment planning. I have some pictures to show you. Here's the staff busting a fire using a Bodro fire set. Busting is just a way of saying making or creating a fire by rubbing sticks together. You show students here hiking up a trail. Like I said, we don't have an adventure therapy program, but here's a shot of some kids just having fun. You can just see that they have a good time together. I talked about bypassing resistance with metaphor. This is a backpack. I remember one of my very first days ever in wilderness therapy in 1995. I was hiking next to a young man, my first student, and he was talking about life at home, how difficult it was, how painful it was. And he was also talking about his backpack because he had not taken much time. He didn't want to listen to staff advice, and he put it on not well. It was leaning over and uncomfortable. And he would go back and forth between complaining about the backpack and his home life. And I started to hear it. I thought, this is a metaphor. It's exactly what's happening at home. He's not listening. He's resistant. He's fighting. He's struggling. He doesn't want to ask for help. He's experiencing pain and discomfort. He's miserable, and he doesn't want to do it anymore. Differentiation and distance. This is the idea where the distance that gets created by the intervention, right? The time apart becomes a metaphor for creating healthy attachment, or what we would call differentiation, right? A healthy balance of connection and separateness. Letters from home. Here's a student reading over another student's shoulder, reading the hopes and intentions letter. Here's a ceremony. This young woman was left for a while after she'd been introduced into the air phase, the highest phase of the program. And they built a mandala for her with their north, south, east, west gates. They'd all shared metaphors with her. And she asked if she could sit for some time in her mandala. It's a cultural difference, right? It's out of the culture of the front country and into the culture of the back country. This is an actual petroglyph from one of our field areas. I have some resources here that you can also access for support. The Independent Educational Consultant Association, the Therapeutic Consulting Association, the National Association of Therapeutic Schools and Programs, the Outdoor Behavioral Health Council, all kinds of therapy and struggling teens. So any of those, if you want to take a picture of that, any of those websites, you can Google those or go to those websites to get more information about programs, about what it means ethically and theoretically and systematically to be a part of a wilderness therapy program. All right, looks like we're out of questions. I can take some up next time. Let me go through upcoming events and announcements. Like I said, we want all parents to attend 6 of these 12-step support groups. Just try them out while your child is with us. Al-Anon, CODA, or Families Anonymous. You can also go to NAMI.org and get free or affordable support in your community, education and lessons. Follow us on social media. This is really important because sometimes the invitations, the announcements get lost in email inboxes or spam filters. So these things can be helpful. The podcasts, of course, are available. If you have an iPhone, use the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. If you have an Android device, download the SoundCloud app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram for inspirational stories, announcements, events. Do a Facebook search and search Evoke Therapy Programs for more of the same. You can also go to the Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook, and there you can find about an organization that we belong to that we support, that helps people who can't afford treatment. Of course, you can also use our blog. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. You can also listen to an audio version on Audible or by the CD. You can also go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page, and there, through the Amazon Smiles program, a percentage of the proceeds goes to help people who can't afford therapy. The next workshop is November 18th and 19th. That's one of those workshops that happen about every 6 weeks. So if you are in the program right now and you haven't gone, you may want to schedule that because it may not come around again. Contact Gail at evoketherapy.com for more information. The next Finding You Intensive, in fact, we might have one spot or it might have been filled today, will be next week. Or actually this week, in 2 days. So probably too late, but we're announcing more Finding You. These are intensive therapeutic programming for adults or families at our Park City location, right outside of Salt Lake City, where you can come if you want to do deeper work, sign up for the Finding You, or if you want to do deeper work with your family or with your children, you can have a private family intensive. One of our private family intensives. Go to our website to learn more or email intensives@evoketherapy.com. Upcoming parent support groups next week in Chicago, the 16th, at the Renaissance Chicago, 6:30 p.m. Southern California, November 26th. That's a Sunday. That's 4 to 5 for the potluck and 5 to 7 for the meeting. And then in New York on December 7th. Looking forward to those. Email Andrea at evoketherapy.com for more information or to our RCP. Our pursuits trips are international and Utah-based adventure trips that you can do for a handful of days, 7 to 14 days, if you want to bring your family. Think of therapy light, right? Think of sober fun for young adults. These can be as few as an individual or as many as a family or a large group. All right, folks. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for your attention for this last hour. The next webinar, next broadcast will be tomorrow evening, November 7th at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and I'll be talking about the loving kindness meditation. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for doing your work. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. Have a great evening and talk to you tomorrow night. Bye-bye.